Dudes, what's up? Don B from the Don B podcast. Check out Atheist Edge. They're all over YouTube. I watch them. I watch every episode. And I'm not lying to you. I would never lie to you. I just lied to you.
This is Bill Cluck, co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club. For those just joining us, we had a little bit of delay coming in on live. I'm James Walker, the Christian co-founder. Bill's the atheist, and this is a little over a year, about I think 13 months that we've been going with the Atheist Christian Book Club. And welcome. We're going to be looking at this book. Maybe we got them out of order a little bit because it's the rebuttal book, but ironically they were both released on the same date, and so I think that's a fair game for that. So one of the things we did is that we contacted some of the co-authors put out a call. Tell them about the book club and that we're going to be looking at the book. They were, the ones that responded back were very, very interested and intrigued by the whole club concept and are appreciative that we did their book. And one of the ones that Bill actually interviewed is the Christian scholar Craig Evans,
who has debated Bart Ehrman and is on equal par with him.
Those of you who read the book saw that he did a chapter or two in there. A lot of the materials on the ossuaries and was Jesus buried or was he eaten by the dogs and how do we know these kinds of things was Craig Evans. So if I think a good way to maybe get our conversation going is to watch the first, I think it's about maybe 11 minutes or so. But this is the video part one of the interview for the book club that Bill Cluck did with Craig Evans. So let's watch that right now.
Oh, by the way, we're really lucky to have James here. James is we're going to be talking about orthodoxy and heteroorthodoxy and heresies. This is like the expert on what is orthodox. He speaks at churches throughout the nation and is there to inform people about cults like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonisms, which is nothing but warmed over Arianism, and lucky that we have somebody that actually knows a lot about what they're talking about.
Okay, let's try again and see if we can get that the video going.
Hello, I'm Bill Cluck, co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club with James Walker. Today we talk about things, books, different Christian books, atheist books, and try to have a respectful, dialogue. And the book we're going to be studying next month, is How God Became Jesus, which is opposed to Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God. It's a response to Bart Ehrman's book, and we're very lucky to have Dr. Craig Evans, who is one of the contributors to the book, along with Michael Bird and others. Dr. Evans got his master's and PhD in biblical studies from Claremont University. He's written over 50 books. He's an expert in early Christianity. I think you're teaching at Houston Baptist Theological Seminary, correct?
Yeah, Houston Baptist University, and the seminary is under its umbrella, correct. So
we're very lucky to have Dr. Evans today, and here goes with the first question. In his book, How Jesus Became God, Bart Ehrman, an agnostic scholar, claims that Jesus never considered himself to be divine, nor did he claim to be God, but that his divinity kind of evolved. In Mark, obviously, he doesn't really say much about himself. You have kind of a bare bones, unvarnished gospel where there's not much on the deity of Jesus. Then 20 years later, we get Matthew and Luke, who have these fictional birth narratives, so you're starting to see the evolution of Jesus as God. And 20 years later, you see the Gospel of John, where he's full-blown deity. He's a pre-existent God. So, Dr. Evans, what is problematic about that? Why is that not plausible?
Okay, what I would say, first of all, is that how Jesus's person is expressed, it evolves in terms of definition, precision, avoiding what turns out to be a problematic way of understanding it, and there are different blind alleys, if you want to call them that, for the next 200 or 300 years, which is why there are church conferences and things like that to sort it out. I'll leave that to church historians. I'll just back up and deal with the Gospels themselves and that context. The first say Jesus' own ministry from the year 30 till the 70s, say first 40 years, and let it go at that. I think Bart is only partly correct in some of the things he says. He's not. I would never say he's always wrong about everything he says, and he's very well informed and he knows stuff very well too. And we've debated. I've known him for more than 30 years. So anyway, but though I think he is wrong on this because, first of all, Judaism doesn't expect a divine Messiah exactly. There are some interesting, diverse views about what is expected for the Messiah. There is not one single view. There is not one set of agreed scriptures. There are a handful that get appealed to all the time in the Old Testament, but otherwise it's a bit of a loose thing. And so there is no need for somebody to be a Messiah to be viewed as divine. So the other thing that needs to be made clear is that the Jewish people are monotheistic, not as strictly so as in rabbinic Judaism, which is in reaction to Trinitarianism of Christianity. So that's a problem. Don't take 5th century, 6th century rabbinic Talmudic Judaism and say that was normative at the beginning of the 1st century, because that's anachronistic. But that said, there'd have to be a pretty heavy burden on an early Jewish Christian movement to talk about Jesus in divine terms if it just isn't there. And so where Bart is correct to some extent is, to say, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, as well as Matthew and Luke, the synoptic gospel tradition, Jesus doesn't walk around saying, oh, by the way, I'm God or I'm divine. But there are some interesting passages where he speaks of himself as the Son. Matthew 11 is one really interesting one. There is his confession to go to Mark. There is his confession before the high priest that clearly in reference to himself as the Son of Man who'll be seated at the right hand. And it's the high priest is greatly outraged, tears his robes. This is blasphemy. There is the authority that Jesus appeals to forgive sins as well, which causes controversy. Who is this? Only God can do that. Jesus alludes in Mark 3, where he's being accused. He's so successful as a healer and exorcist that those who oppose him and criticize him suggest that perhaps he's made a pact with the devil. And that's why he's empowered, and that's why he's able to do things that go way beyond what other healers and exorcists have ever been able to do. And so Jesus, in responding to that, to the illogic of this argument, so on, he actually talks about one who is greater in order to defeat the strong man. Well, in his language there in Mark 3, the strong man is Satan, and yet he's been overpowered by one who is greater. You read Daniel, and an angel says to Daniel that he's delayed because he was opposed by what we interpreters think is supposed to be Satan. He's described as an angel there. But so to say that you're stronger than the strong man, and in context that's clearly Satan, to say you have the authority to forgive sins, to say you're going to be seated on the throne of God at the right hand of the Father, that's a pretty serious thing. But there's one last. I'm still talking about the Synoptic Gospels and leaving John alone, because that's very much upgraded in its presentation in theology and Christology. But Jesus responds to the imprisoned John the Baptist, who sends messengers who says, are you the one who is coming, or should we look for someone else? And most interpreters agree that's there's no question this is authentic. This is not some kind of Christian passage. Right. Jesus responds with words and phrases that allude to Isaiah about how he can do this and that, or go back and tell John what you're seeing. And what's really interesting, the reason I appeal to this passage, it isn't just that it's a messianic response, as we now know, thanks to Qumran 4Q 521. But the 4Q 521 passage alludes to not only the same Isaiah passages, but to one of the Psalms where these are the deeds of Yahweh. And I don't believe in coincidences when you do ancient historical work. You know, we wish we had more dots to connect. We wish we had more sources than we do. Our sources are fragmentary. So unless there's a real good reason to see this as just a coincidence or irrelevant, and I don't see that because the correspondence with the Matthew 11, Luke 7, we usually call that Q, and the parallel with 4Q and 521, it's so rich, and the potential of it is so awesome. In other words, Jesus is saying, I'm doing Yahweh's works. I'm doing what Yahweh himself does.
Right.
And so, and I'll just add one more thing and I'll stop, but this is in the Synoptic Gospels. This is in Q, this is in Mark, the principal passages I've alluded to. So it's the earliest streams of tradition within the Synoptic Gospels. So I'm not making any appeal to John. And then the other thing, too, even earlier than Mark at the earliest is dated in the 60s, some dated in the 70s,
right,
so
right.
Whatever. But you have Paul writing a decade earlier. You have Paul writing some of his letters in the 50s, where you have what are called Yahweh texts, and he applies them to Jesus. And I think that's important because Paul, we know something about his credentials. We're not real sure about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know, there's the church tradition about who wrote them, but we don't really know.
Right.
And Paul, we do know a lot about him. We've got the narrative in Acts. We've got his own letters. He does refer to himself from time to time. He talks about his own credentials. And so this guy is as pretty close to being an Orthodox Jew as anybody could be, as a Pharisee and really into righteousness and so on. So we would assume that he would have a pretty conservative and high view of Jewish monotheism as it existed at that time. And yet he applies Yahweh text to Jesus. Where is he getting this? Why does he have such an exalted Christology so early on? He would have to know what he's doing. And his skills with both the Greek text and the Hebrew text, his own credentials, having been tutored and discipled by Gamaliel and so on. That's why I think there actually is a pretty good early tradition that Jesus is divine. How exactly that gets articulated, you know, the God-man Christology part of it, the Trinitarian part of it,
right.
That, of course, is what Christians then debate and go back and forth on how to articulate it. But this is where I do disagree with Bart Ehrman. The idea that nobody thought of Jesus as divine during his ministry or in the immediate aftermath of the Easter proclamation, I think that's questionable. I just don't think this Jewish movement, and don't forget, they didn't wake up one day and say, you know what, we're Christians, we've got more in common with Gentiles than we do with our Jewish heritage. Not at all. And so they see themselves very much as part of the Jewish people, part of the Israelite Jewish heritage, and for them to talk about Jesus in divine terms, that's very startling. There had to be something that pushed them in that direction, and even though that made it harder in a lot of ways to convince a skeptical synagogue that this person really is the Savior, really is the Son of God, really is Israel's Messiah. Anyway, that's how I reason from a historical point of view, not from a confessional point of view. That adds
right.
other elements to the equation.
But speaking of, I want to go back to Mark, and I've heard the apologetic of Jesus forgave sins. That's an indication of a high Christology. And I think in the book, one of the authors says that in Mark, we can see a high Christology and at the trial. But if the disciples weren't at the trial and that was pure fiction, as the forgiveness of sin, the healing of the paralytic, if these things are fiction, if it was just an invention of the storyteller, well, that throws that high Christology right out the window, doesn't it?
Well, of course, and we could always play that card. We could always deny any evidence that doesn't fit our preference or our preferred theory. And if we do that, that's going down a certain path that raises a whole other question that relates to historiography and epistemology. And by the way, I deal with this all the time. I deal with mythicists. They don't have any problem. They just deny everything, and Jesus doesn't exist, and that's the end of the debate.
And I wanted to tell you that you have atheists that are on your side. I heard your YouTube interview with Richard Carey, we do believe in Jesus as a historical figure, absolutely.
Sure.
And by the way, Robert Price is another PhD. You're familiar with him, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and he debated Bart Ehrman and got kind of obliterated by Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman was playing the conservative, defender of the faith kind of in that debate.
He does that very well. I haven't
right.
Jesus exists. I mean,
yeah.
I use some of his lines. My favorite in my debate with Richard Carey, I don't remember what it was, a couple of years ago, I guess, and I quoted Bart. I said, look, if Jesus didn't exist, you'd think his brother James would have known that.
Well, I interviewed David Fitzgerald, another one of the big mythicists, and he just would have none of it. He said, oh, that's not the James, the brother Jesus, James of Damascus, or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. But,
Well, we're back now. Bill gets good, interesting interview. Any thoughts you had on part one of that interview from last week?
Well, I mean, the guy knows what he's talking about. He gives some good evidence. And what do you guys think? I see Jim furiously writing notes. What do you think of his
I didn't read the book. I didn't do my homework.
Yeah, but I mean, just
someone's read the book. Let them.
Let me say this, and maybe I should have said this at the very beginning, and because Bill and I have talked about this several times. One of the things that, in looking at both of these books, we need to say nobody's trying to answer the question, was Jesus God? That's a whole separate issue. The question we're trying to deal with is, how did this idea arise? Was it a late invention in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries? Is it something that didn't happen until Nicaea? Was it the mythicists right? Jesus never even existed until, decades or centuries later when somebody makes up the story. Or do we have a very early roots of this that we can see going all the way back to the teaching ministry of Jesus and all the way back to the proclamation of Paul within 20 years of the crucifixion? That can be addressed. That is something that's historical, it's tangible, it's not a matter of faith, it's a matter of looking at evidence, historical evidence. So that's what we're trying to clarify on this. So you could end up saying, I think that Craig Evans is right. I think this is a very early teaching of the church. But they were wrong because Jesus didn't rise from the dead. You can say that. But we're trying to just deal with the issue of how did this concept of Jesus being God, how did it develop?
So, Chris, you got your finger on the Bible as an atheist. You got Bible for that, for your view? Or
I was just flipping through looking for some other stuff. But one thing that Evans did bring up, and I think he may have mentioned it in the book too, the idea that the Jews were not looking for the type of Messiah that Jesus turned out to be, supposedly. They were looking for a earthly king, earthly ruler. They were looking for someone who would not die an ignominious death. And then that's put forth as evidence in favor of Christianity, that if you were inventing a Messiah, you would invent the Messiah that the Jews were expecting. So there's evidence that Jesus was not expected, therefore that laid some credibility. I'd be interested to get the input from the Christians in the group. What is wrong with saying that the disciples and early followers were expecting that kind of Messiah, then Jesus died? They didn't want to give up their belief that Jesus was the Messiah, so they had to come up with some sort of rationalization as to how he could still be the Messiah without fulfilling certain criteria. And they came up with this new concept of the Messiah that, he resurrected from the dead, and this is a show of his divine power, or stuff along that line.
So my answer to that would be, first of all, I just want to take a clip out of that, because Bill said, we believe in Jesus, and I just want to over again. I think that's the context. I didn't hear the rest, but my answer to that would be that it's because it's a cumulative case. It's a cumulative case. So that is okay to say, but one of the things that Ehrman himself says, Ehrman, I don't know how to say it. I say it different like every time. That he even says is that they believed that Jesus was risen from the dead, which is one of the points. Just because you believe it doesn't mean it's true, but that they were actually convinced that he rose from the dead, I think, just adds to the cumulative case.
Okay, I'm not saying they didn't believe he rose from the dead. I'm saying they had this belief, and they used that to support their faith, which had been quite shaken when he died. I don't know if they saw him themselves. I think Ehrman actually believed that's historical, that they had some sort of experience. Or maybe they heard stories of other people who saw him and took that as evidence, but they came up with this nice idea that, oh, he's not really dead. We didn't actually lose here. He's actually resurrected and he's totally coming back someday.
And Chris, I think others can address this as well, and Todd maybe, but I think most Christians would agree with you that the disciples were looking for a whole different kind of Messiah, and you even see the residue evidence of that in the gospel accounts, where they say, Jesus says, "I'm going to be crucified." No, when am I going to be able to sit at your right hand? And they're looking for this very Jewish concept of a kingly Messiah who's going to come and overthrow the oppressors, the Roman government, and return Israel to its glory way beyond under the Davidic kingdom. So I think you're right in that sense that they were looking for a whole different kind of thing. Todd, did you?
Well, yeah. Jesus wasn't alone in claiming to be the Messiah. There were many, many false messiahs that are on record. What makes the followers of this Messiah different to where, like, well, no, we can't give up? Because the other ones, they played out, they were killed, and their disciples just disbanded and moved on, looking for another one maybe, or becoming discouraged. Why were this group of people so different from the other ones? Why didn't they just say, well, I guess we missed it, which is that's what the biblical record says that they assumed in the beginning.
I think too, you have, if you look at Matthew's gospel, the cumulative case that he presents to the Jewish audience, if you accept the thesis that he was writing to Jews, where he links Jesus in the wilderness with the Satan or the adversary. He's building a case that would tie directly back into Old Testament literature. And if you're trying to appeal to a monotheistic culture and trying to sell a dead Messiah, he goes to great lengths to go back to the Old Testament and use Old Testament language that would have been very familiar to the temple Jews of that time. So I think, to me, if you're a ragtag bag of Messiah following people, you got a few people hanging around Jerusalem and your chief died, and you want to sell this to the established first century temple Judaism, I think the appeal to the Jewish audience, to me, makes a solid case. The Jews would have really had to have seen and experienced, and Matthew's, the way he ties back into the Old Testament, I think, makes for a compelling case that this was real. Absolutely.
We have a caller coming. A texter coming in on our social media that's watching. Do we know where they're from, Renee?
No, I don't. Her name is Carrie, and she asked, shouldn't there be more witness reports if hundreds of people witnessed him after this supposed resurrection?
Okay,
shouldn't there be more witness reports if hundreds of people witnessed him after the supposed resurrection?
Okay, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that there were 500 eyewitnesses, the majority of whom are still alive. Why don't we have 500 Gospels? Or not 500, why don't we have at least, more than the 4 accounts that we have? Good question. Any ideas on that?
One thing I could add to that was historically when Titus came and destroyed the temple in 79, it scattered that entire city. So a lot of the witnesses, and so we don't know what happened to these guys, but if you read Josephus' account of what happened during that time of the siege, when Titus came through, you see that there was an awful lot of destruction. So if these 500 or so witnesses were around, I certainly can imagine they got scattered every which way. And the last thing in that culture is being able to write things down. So the fact that it ended up in an oral tradition seems very plausible in this time frame.
And we know there were other sources, either written or oral, M, L, Q. So just because we don't have them today doesn't mean they never existed.
Oh no, there's a lot of people believe in Q. I mean, I believe. But speaking of the witnesses, and I bring this up at the trial. Obviously, the disciples had checked out. So, where did we get this from? The trial, most scholars believe, is just an invention. Obviously, releasing Barabbas, Romans would have never done that. I mean, Pilate was too ruthless for Rome. He was recalled, so he wasn't into releasing, traitors and criminals. So it's just, if that's fiction, if the baptism is probably real. that.
Now, Bill, is that most scholars or most credible scholars?
Pretty strong.
Well, now you look at Raymond Brown, who says that the early Christians at Jesus' resurrection, that's when Jesus was adopted. He was favored to become, elevated to Godhead. And then they said, well, maybe at the Transfiguration, where they had Peter and Moses and Elijah with Jesus, and obviously that's fictional because Moses represents the law, Elijah represents the prophets. So, Mark is just creating a fictional account of this is the culmination of the law and the prophets, Jesus Christ. He's trying to elevate Christ. And then Raymond Brown says maybe at his baptism he actually was exalted. And we do have at his baptism it says, Jesus, this is my son whom I'm well pleased with. So, and then obviously 20 years later you have in the fictional birth narratives, you have Jesus becoming, being born of a virgin and that sort of thing.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Curious how you know that the Transfiguration was fiction?
Because he says his reasoning is Moses and Elijah. Elijah kind of represents the prophets. Moses kind of represents the law. Therefore, that couldn't have happened because it's too perfect. It means that Jesus is the
Bart
culmination of the law
Ehrman
and the
told him
prophets.
so.
That syllogism doesn't quite follow.
I will say this. Bill and I talked about this as well. We're looking at sources, and we would love to have sources that, like in the Jerusalem Times, the next day that we find the newspaper that talks about this. It would be very nice.
Yeah, there wasn't anything from the Jerusalem Post to say, oh yeah, here we go. And the 500 witnesses. Where's the interviews? Where's the hospital?
The Twitter
we don't know anything about
There's
them.
a corollary question to that also. Where were the people who disagreed that those witnesses existed? Because you'd think there would have been an uproar if this whole thing was falsified.
Yeah,
It didn't exist.
Well,
To make a claim like that,
let me quote the great John Dominic Crossan: the people that cared didn't know where the body was, and the people, that knew where it was, okay, like if it was in a, like a misplaced tomb or whatever, that's a popular theory, didn't care. Because this was just some criminal. So
those that cared didn't know, and those that knew didn't care. That's the pithy way of trying to say that.
One of the things,
and that's addressed, by the way, in next month's interview.
Well,
with
actually,
Michael. Was it this one?
Craig Evans.
Craig Evans.
Go ahead.
one of the things that Craig Evans addressed is, kind of puts a lot of this stuff in the Gospels to rest, because the question is, did the Christians believe Jesus was God? And let's say the gospel. Let's go with your, the mark was unvarnished and it's built up. Well, Craig Evans mentioned the fact that Paul wrote way before the Gospels were written. And do you find a high Christology in Paul's writings?
That's an excellent point. And I think Bart Ehrman said Philippians 2:5, where it says Jesus didn't want to
So it
grasp.
undercuts this whole escalation in the Gospels argument.
So Ehrman himself learned from this process of writing this book, because prior to writing this book, he had a more evolutionary view of the divinity of Jesus developing more gradually over time. But he came to realize that, it was earlier, and they did perceive of Jesus as divine earlier than he had thought, but the definition of divine is still in play, because there's different gradations. And I think Craig Evans kind of missed that. He basically accused Ehrman of not thinking Jesus was not of saying that the early followers didn't think he was divine, but he did actually say that.
And in Colossians, it says, in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, which that's kind of
I'm not sure what else you could say. There was the Enochic Son of Man, who was very much like a god, and it's covered in what was Michael Bird talked about that as well. And one of the scholars, an evangelical scholar, feels that was a very difficult passage to see that how Enoch was, or it was venerated as, or is it 3rd Enoch? I think it was. That this Daniel Son of Man figure was actually being worshipped next to God's seat in heaven, his throne. So there were all kinds of currents going on. It wasn't just a strict monotheism.
I would agree with Bart Ehrman that this whole idea of hypostatic union and Jesus was fully God and fully man simultaneously, and the Trinitarian doctrine, that was not articulated. That did, as they went back to say, well, do you believe Jesus is God? Yes, from very early time we talk about Jesus being divine and having the prerogatives of God. Okay, is he the same person as the Father? Well, no, he prays to the Father. Okay, well, is there more than one God? Well, no, there's only one God. And to try to address those things, that's when they had to say, okay, how are we going to take all these things and spell them out? And it did take time. That was a process. That wasn't something that you find the Nicene Creed anywhere in the Gospels.
But there's less disagreement than we really want to put on. I mean, I think most Christians don't believe that the disciples thought Jesus was the third person of the Trinity while they were walking around Galilee.
No, I don't think they understood the concept of the Trinity.
This took 4 centuries to develop.
Exactly.
You had, and
there was a development.
It was.
Bartleman's written a book called.
But I mean, even the full understanding of like the modern or the Nicene understanding of Jesus' equality with God, I don't think you could make a historical case that they actually thought he was co-equal with God.
No, it took centuries to develop. See, Christianity, Bartleman wrote a book, Lost Christianities, where Christianity at first was not a monolithic thing. You had like the Gnostics that believed he was all God and not human. You had the Ebionites that thought he was human but not divine. You had, and then later, like this is like 200 years later, you have the modalists that believe it's God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all one God expressing himself in 3 different views. And Tertullian goes, that doesn't make any sense, because is Jesus praying to himself on the cross? And
these
it's ridiculous.
Inferior forms of Christianity, we call them heresies, but these inferior forms of Christianity could not stand up over time.
Yeah.
So every once in a while, you'll see the Jehovah's Witnesses come along and try to reinvigorate Arianism or something like that. But when the Christians would say, once you say Jesus is divine, then that has definition to it. You can't say he became God, because God, by definition, from the monotheistic definition, has always been God. You can't become God one day and not be God the next day. Right. And so once you start with what I think even Ehrman would say was very early with Paul, 20 years after the crucifixion, saying that talking about it, Jesus not counting it. His equality with God, something to be grasped onto. When you have that high Christology, it does take a time to work that out. Well, was Jesus not a man? He was God? No, he was both. And that to flesh that out takes a long time. And a lot of it's in answer to these heresies as they come up. Mm-hmm. It's just like nobody even thought of this idea of modalism. Of course, that's not what we believe, but we never even thought to counteract it. Mm-hmm. It's a brand new idea.
And even at the Council of Nicaea, you still had modalist thought, for about a century, until the Council of Chalcedon in 451 or whatever. I mean, they just took forever. Do you have a question?
Well, I was going to make a point. I mean, I would like to remind us all that simply because these other explorations are done, that free inquiry is a valid thing, and the fact that the Trinity viewpoint won out doesn't take away from the idea that we shouldn't explore what these other things were. As you said, they're inferior. But the fact that these things did exist doesn't mean that the truth is somehow denied. If the Trinity itself is a true concept, the fact that we have trouble explaining it, and we have these other alternatives, they're worthy of exploration. But as you already are arguing, there comes a point to where you rationally decide to reject or embrace some of these elements.
Don't we see the same thing in science? There's scientific theories that are held to by a lot of people, but over time, as you begin to flesh that out and look at other models, you realize that scientific theory cannot, it becomes abandoned because it was inferior.
But it's backed up by data, though. What new data has come in about Jesus between...
And how we decide how we view Jesus? At the Council of Nicaea, the reason this came about is Emperor Constantine said, look, I want this empire unified. You guys better get your act together and get on the same page, because they had this heresy out of North Africa by Arian, and then Athanasius, this from Alexander, and they just had 2 different views of God. And Arian believed that he was a created being, that he was begat, where Athanasius believed that he was co-equal right from the get-go, and it was by a vote. And it's not like Dan Brown's
No,
Da Vinci
actually-
Code. I mean, it was basically an overwhelming vote, but still,
Wait a minute.
they had more Arians than. Am I not right?
What do you think the vote was?
No, it's like 2 people dissented. Yeah.
2 or 3.
Yeah. But my point is that you had more Arians throughout the Mediterranean. Did you not have more followers of Arius in the Mediterranean than?
Well, I don't ever know if that was true. If
Well,
that had been the case, they would have won at the Council of Nicaea.
Not necessarily.
Every part of the known world was represented.
But you know, they had many followers of Arius.
Was Constantine's mom already a Christian at the time?
Yeah, of
A
course.
lot of
yes.
influence.
Yeah.
Most of them were in his family.
But he never had a vote and really didn't have a dog in the fight. I don't think he showed up. He may have been there.
But what I'm saying, this didn't come down from outside. This took hundreds of years to get this right. And even now we don't get it right.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's debated even today. You find a rejection of the Trinity that's here, or other modalism is here. I mean, we all have that. So
a lot of Christians in the churches are modalists. They just don't know what they believe.
Yeah, but that's fair in an inquiry on this. So if we're all really wanting to find where the truth is, though, that's okay.
Yeah. A lot of Christians in churches haven't put much thought into what they believe at all.
Oh no, they just think that my minister's so hip and the music's really cool. And I don't even know why I'm here. My neighbor invited me.
I hate to say this, but I will go ahead and admit in front of everybody. Some of the atheists here take this much more seriously about what Christian theology does and does not teach than many Christians do. And I have to say that.
I think we're talking about 2 different things here in the last few minutes. One is this development of the doctrine of the Trinity. The core question tonight, I think, is the divinity of Christ and when was he considered to be divine? Was he considered to be divine by the earliest believers, the original disciples, Paul, and then their followers?
But you would agree with Ken that if you say, when did they say we believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, you're not talking about until the 4th century or something.
Well, I'm still not sure. We still haven't figured out.
Okay.
It's something that we can't understand.
Well, what's unfortunately, we have what's called the tunnel period in Christianity from when Christ died in 30 or whatever to 50, our earliest writings from Paul, where we don't know what was going on. And, it's just, we would love to have some sources there, but we don't.
Not yet, but that's the hope. Like Chris was saying, what's going to change our viewpoints on here? Well, the archaeology and what we find, what may emerge in further inquiry, more thought, may reveal better.
Look at the Nag Hammadi library where you have the Gospel of Judas, where Judas is the good guy, and the Gospel of Philip, and 50 Gospels.
It seems like every discovery. You're complaining about a 20-year gap. The Nag Hammadi library, the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Jude, you're looking at 3rd, 4th century. Gospel of Thomas may have been earlier than that.
Yes, thank you.
But the rest of the entire library, this is very late, so you can't have your cake and eat it.
Well, the Gospel of Thomas, which some people do date to 50, that has no birth narrative or no trial, no passion of Jesus. It's just 114 sayings of Jesus, which are somewhere just like the Synoptics.
But I would
somewhere on Q.
Yeah.
I would note that when it came time to do the canonization of the Scriptures, some of the criteria they used were when in doubt, leave it out, and what was common to all of the churches. So these are 2 reasonable expectations. So we know there was a flood of a lot of these other things out there. So it's Occam's razor applied here that guide us to the canon that we have now, that's there now. So what's going to shape that or change that is only any revealing of any new archaeological information that comes out.
Well, the Song of the Shepherd was read as scripture throughout the Mediterranean. It didn't make the cut.
And then, of course, it's scrutinized accordingly, according to what we understand in the canon of Scripture as well. And does it contradict it? Does it reveal something new?
And they were thinking of, instead of Revelation, making the Epistle of Barnabas make the...
Yeah,
we have
Revelation barely made it in. Jude barely made it in. Peter barely made it in.
Todd's wasting 3 years on studying the book of Revelation on an acid trip. I mean, that is... But it actually is kind of fascinating.
Let's do this. We have another call coming in, or another somebody that's joined us on Facebook Live that has either a comment or question. Renee, would you relay that to us?
Yes. Question 1, and this is from John Hinkey. He said, if the resurrection was so convincing, why did Christianity not take off among the Jewish people of Jerusalem and surrounding areas? From the textual record, it appears that the Jewish Christian community in that area, James or the, and I don't know if I'm saying this one right, Ebionites or Ebionites?
Ebionites.
For example, remained very Jewish. The Ebionites didn't believe core doctrines such as the virgin birth. Christianity in a form that began to look like we know it today only really took off among Hellenistic Jews and Gentiles far from Jerusalem. Doesn't that undermine the idea of the power of the resurrection as evidence for Christianity? Instead, it was the story relayed by people who were not eyewitnesses that succeeded in spreading Christianity.
Well, thanks for joining us, John. That's an excellent series of questions. That was more than one question, but some good questions for us. That's question one. Okay.
Can I answer that real quick? What happened when Paul in Acts, and we read this in Todd's Bible study, he would go to the Jews first. He'd go to the synagogues. The synagogue said, "Get out of here. You know, this just doesn't make any sense."
Not universally.
Well, obviously, there were some Jews. So he goes, "How am I going to get this religion off the ground?" And he goes, pork sandwiches. Yes, you can eat pork. And the circumcision thing is killing us. You know, 30-year-old men getting circumcised. That's done. Although Paul played a Bill Clinton because he goes, one of his, who was it, Demas or one of his, Timothy? Timothy. He goes, "Should I get circumcised? They are really on my case about this." And he goes, "I tell you, just get circumcised." Yeah. Here's this early religion, and they're just trying to work things out, and they don't know really where to go. Should we stay Jewish? Should we, compromise? And what's happened is we've inherited Pauline Christianity where we can eat a pork sandwich, and we, thank goodness, do not have to be circumcised.
But Acts says that the Council of Jerusalem came up with those practices. They didn't say don't eat pork to the Gentile Christians. So.
Well, obviously, the writer of Acts is smoothing these differences.
Christianity, I guess.
Well, but it's smoothing these differences over. Peter and Paul said, "Look, I confronted Peter, and I let him have it." So what the writer of Acts is doing is, you got to remember, this is written by Christians. It's heavily biased. They have a theological axe to grind. So you can't take everything you read as historical fact.
Well, addressing of the Christianity just really flopping in Jerusalem.
Did it?
You have something called the Day of Pentecost, which was pretty powerful. You have I think some of the early disciples and apostles were Jewish, were they? Some of them.
Absolutely. James, his brother. Yeah.
So I mean, it's not a total failure. Let's put it that way. Now it's true.
And that was the lead church in Jerusalem.
And Paul's even deferring to that later date. He takes it to the council where in Jerusalem. So yeah, and
somebody thought it was worthwhile to write a pretty lengthy letter of instructions to the Jerusalem church. It's called the Book of Hebrews.
Yeah. And you also have with the complaint about not having. We don't know what happened during the tunnel period. So there's this 20-year moratorium on any communication. You do have Luke, or the writer of Acts, reporting what happened during that time. So it's not like there's no historical evidence.
The speeches of Peter.
I don't think the point of the question was to say that there was no church in Jerusalem, but if there was a huge event like the resurrection, it should have been like an earthquake, shattering, just a bomb going off. And that should have been the epicenter of everything going on. It should have radiated out from there, but instead we see a lot of activity outside of that center as being the primary focus of the expansion. And so it didn't. And those people became Christians not because they witnessed the resurrection, it's because they heard the stories. Right. The stories themselves were compelling enough. It didn't have to actually happen, or they didn't have to see it happen or experience it themselves. It was just the word of mouth.
More blessed are those who don't see but believe.
Right.
You have Paul's itinerant. I mean, Acts, Luke records that Paul going to the Gentiles. And I mean, when he's writing to Colossae in the 60s, he's got that high Christology where he's saying everything in the heavens and on the earth are by him and through him.
Right.
And so in his travels around the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean and in the Hellenistic world, I mean, I think that's why that would be the main occasion for why you'd have success in the Christian faith out there in those realms. But he was from the Jerusalem area, a former Jew, going to the Gentiles. He had the Old and the New Testament going to people that, so I think that would be why you would have the success in the Hellenistic.
Do we have another question from John?
Well, you also have to think about this, and that you did have thousands get saved on the day of Pentecost, but then why did they disperse? Well, you had heavy persecution in Jerusalem.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, I mean, I think that kind of answers his question is you did have a bunch, and they basically ran out of town, or ran out of town.
Now, whether it was coincidence or fortune or what have you, the famine and the persecution in Jerusalem caused the remaining Christians in Jerusalem to be in a terrible financial and social situation, to which Paul is going around raising all this money to help the brothers back in Jerusalem, and so he's collecting that from the Gentile Christians, and coincidentally had to have endeared the Gentiles. If you want to say, are they really our brothers in Christ? They're not even Jewish. Let me show you the check I brought you. So I think they are brothers after all. So there's a little bit of that going on, perhaps.
And who was in charge of Jerusalem and Judea politically and militarily? And what was their motive? Did they want Christianity to spread? Did Pilate and the Pharisees want Christianity to spread?
No, I mean, they were united in that. For all their differences of the hatred that the Jews had for the Roman Empire, they agreed on that. This Christianity thing must stop.
But, and, in Pentecost, where you have 3,000 saved, and the next day it's 2,000. At that rate, the whole city would have been converted in a month, And we got Greg Laurie coming June 10th, okay? You've got an infrastructure of churches, you've got marketing, you've got promotion, and I don't even know if he'll get 3,000 converts. So 3,000 in a day? That's what's more realistic in Acts is when Paul goes to the Greeks and Mars Hill and a few believe. Okay, that is historically valid. Pentecost, no.
So if Luke is just making it all up, why not a success everywhere he goes? Why is he putting in all these failures?
Yeah, so basically,
well, because there is some historical credibility to it.
It's not just choosing whatever suits you.
Because you're saying like
you're saying for other religions, right? I mean, you wouldn't believe everything that the Quran says, even though some of it might be true.
But you would evaluate each claim of itself. I mean, but what you're doing is you're saying there, you would need thousands and thousands of people for us to believe that this was a real thing in Jerusalem. There were thousands. Now, we can't believe that there were thousands.
Hey, Bill, what about this? What if, I don't know, 47 days earlier, there was this guy who rose from the dead, and then word got around town over these next 4 weeks, and then all of a sudden this guy comes and starts preaching and telling you all about it. I mean, the table was set for it to happen, for the thousands to come. So I don't think it's as...
You hear Jim? The great confession there.
That's why
that raises a larger question about Jesus' persistence on earth after his resurrection. He was, 40 days according to Luke, maybe immediately according to the other Gospels. But so they had the privilege of seeing him face to face. They got to touch him and everything. And man, if that happened to me, if I got to touch him, I believe.
Ken, have you ever read, which I'm sure being a Bible translator you have, in the last part of Matthew, the risen, resurrected Lord Jesus Christ is there talking to the disciples. You know what it says?
Don't recognize some doubted.
Some doubted. Yeah. Well, my Lord, if they're doubting and they got the risen Lord there, how in the world am I supposed to believe?
He had a cloaking device on. They didn't recognize him at first. They had to wash his feet and some stuff, right?
And it's not just the risen Lord, it's all their friends and relatives who came up out of their graves at his resurrection and started hanging out for a while before they went back in. If that happened, I think everyone in Jerusalem would have been a believer.
But don't you expect that to be
not all skeptics are data-driven. Maybe
but I mean, isn't that
aren't pure in terms of their evaluation of the data.
You're not really Grandma. You're a vision.
But don't you see that's a skeptic's attitude? The fact that they didn't recognize him, they were really on their guard against it, just kind of shows the mindset. They would be just like us if somebody come up raising from the dead. I mean, looking at it, is that really the guy? Or, I mean, there's a valid human response here from a skeptic's perspective to look at that and say, well, it's plausible some people would be thinking, I don't know if this is real.
Every Christian has some skeptic in them.
Yeah, but waves of zombies you actually see and recognize them, well, that removes all doubt. But my point was going to be that how is it that these people got to have that privilege of that concrete evidence, whereas we have to sit here 2,000 years later and kind of probe into the text and see, does this mean this? Does it mean that?
And tease it out.
Yeah.
What's historical? What's not?
Just stick around and end all doubt for us? There's nothing preventing him from having stuck around for 2,000 years and convinced us all.
I mean, he could just appear in this room and settle the whole deal.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know. Among the skeptics, they may not be so convinced.
I had a Mormon friend, and I asked. He was explaining me about.
Did you want to say something, Terry?
Terry,
did you find this compelling? I mean, his arguments.
Well, I didn't, because I mean, we can start right here with the zombies, and
It doesn't.
Well, like, let me play the devil's advocate. The church did start in Jerusalem, where it could have been easily falsified, where you would have critics saying, "Oh, that's insane.
Where are the zombies?"
Yeah, you would, if you wanted to start a movement and it wasn't true, you would start it other than Jerusalem, where, do you see what I'm saying, where critics could go and, you know.
I think we kind of cut off a little bit there. You still remember where your thoughts were on that?
I was just going to say, I had a Mormon friend in high school, and he was teaching me about the plates, and I said, well, where are the golden plates? And he says, oh, they were taken up to heaven. And I said to him, well, how convenient, you know? And then I started thinking, because I was a believer at the time, and I started thinking privately, it's like, well, I have a faith like that, where Jesus was taken up and the evidence was removed. So how is it any different? You know, that kind of set me back a little bit.
I think there are a lot of differences. That's a subject probably for another night. How many of the eyewitnesses of the golden plates stayed together? And
you can find differences.
That's actually an argument for Mormonism, is they didn't recount even when they left the Mormon faith.
Oh, they didn't?
No. Ask the expert here.
Well, you have the testimony of 8 witnesses. I'm a former Mormon, for those who don't know, before I became a Christian. You have the testimony of 8 witnesses and also the testimony of 3 witnesses that is recorded. We do know now that that signed testimony was altered, the testimony of 8 witnesses. They were testifying that Joseph Smith was the author of the Book of Mormon, which, of course, no Mormon believes that. And so most of them left the Mormon church at some point, stopped believing in Joseph Smith as a prophet, but we don't have a record of them actually saying they didn't see the gold plates. What we do have, though, is somebody describing the event, one of the witnesses, saying that it was similar to somebody giving you a picture, a mind picture of something that was so clear that it was like you saw it in your mind's eye, and that's how he saw the gold plates, something along those lines.
But see, they didn't recant their testimony.
Recanted Joseph Smith, recanted their Mormonism, but they didn't come back and say, I lied about that.
Right.
Yes.
I think but how many of the disciples and Paul recanted their Christianity in their lifetime?
We don't know.
I mean, I'm sure there were some, under persecution. Not of those.
Yeah.
Judas.
Yeah.
There's differences definitely between Mormonism and Christianity. The point of comparison I was trying to make, and the only point was that the plates went up and Jesus went up.
Yeah, but I think. Let me say this: we do have another question coming in. I think from online from our Facebook Live audience.
Carrie again has a question. She said, "Are there doctrines that were accepted at the Nicene Creed as being 100% Scripture truth that more informed Christians today would state is incorrect? If so, is it that far-fetched to think that these bigger concepts that were decided could also be incorrect?" She said, "By the way, Josephus reports that Jesus' disciples claim to have seen him 3 days after his crucifixion, but he doesn't mention the greater number mentioned in the New Testament."
Mm-hmm. And we've had discussions before about the Josephus. There's actually 2 Josephus references to Jesus, and one of them almost certainly, I think all Christian scholars agree, was embellished. So we don't want to put a whole lot of stock in that, but she's right. In neither of the accounts, even the embellished one, we don't have 500 witnesses that Paul talked about. So she's correct on that observation. What was the first part of her question again?
Are there doctrines that were accepted in the Nicene Creed as being 100% Scripture that more informed Christians today would state is incorrect?
Okay.
And if so, is it that far-fetched to think that these bigger concepts that were decided could also be incorrect?
Okay, were there any of the concepts that were agreed upon by the bishops at the Council of Nicaea that more informed Christians today would say we don't believe that anymore? Right. I would say no on the Council of Nicaea. Now, there were later, more like Roman Catholic councils that happened that a lot of evangelicals would question some of those. But on primitive, early, up to the 4th century and even beyond, there's total agreement. So you won't have any informed. Now you'll have some uninformed Christians who can't articulate the doctrine of the Trinity. We talked about that problem early on in this meeting. But no, there's no Orthodox evangelical Christian that's going to say that the Council of Nicaea got it wrong on any of that I know of. Does anybody have any?
I'm not aware of it either.
I mean, I think it's the definition of orthodoxy today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
True.
So you have heretics, and you have what's considered to be counterfeit Christian groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses who would deny the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah. So what you're saying is no, because in the definition of orthodoxy, we would say it. So it's kind of circular, our answer, honestly, right?
Yeah.
But we don't have another answer.
But I think that with the Reformation, for example, you had more Bible-centered form of Christianity that goes back and says we're not going to rely on popes or church councils. We're going to go back to scriptures. And there was even a question about the what they would call the radical Reformation, that maybe we haven't taken it far enough. What about believers' baptism? What about immersion? What about these things? How much of Catholicism are we going to hold on to, and how much are we going to reticent or reject? And so I think that what came out of that, though, is that if there was a belief by anything from the Reformation over, as far as Protestant forms of Christianity, that the Catholic Church or earlier councils got it wrong according to Scriptures, they would reject it, as they have some of the later councils. Mm-hmm. You have like it was the 1800s, I believe, that the Catholic Church finally got around to a council that ratified that Jesus was the perpetual virginity of Mary. Yeah. And so no Protestant's going to hold on to that.
Yeah.
What's interesting, I find, and getting actually in the book on 47, I think it's Michael Bird's essay. The whole crux of what we're talking about, we're talking with documents from the time period, from antiquity. And Ehrman said in the council, he's quoted as saying, we can't talk about the Word of God since we don't know what the original words even were. But nevertheless, Bird points out that Ehrman somehow still is able to derive interpretation from the New Testament texts themselves. And so I think it's really interesting that we have the historicity. Everything that we're talking about is textual, and that so we have a volume of text for the Christian faith, and then so the counter claims against the Christian faith don't have anywhere near documents. They're just sort of a shoulder shrug speculation to some degree, but they don't have the enormous amount of documentation that we seem to have from antiquity with Scripture.
We have the point you brought up. We have an interview with Michael Bird that we're going to play next month.
Okay.
And this is going to be Bill interviewed him. What was it, last week or earlier this week?
And
earlier this
Michael
week.
Bird.
Go. And that was, I think, one of the questions you asked him was along those lines. I can't remember if that's one of the ones that we got to deal with or not, but it was a good question, and Ken has a kind of another whole take on that.
Did you want to give your take, Ken, on that?
Yeah. So. Ehrman's first big breakout book was Misquoting Jesus, which is about textual criticism.
Yeah, I read that one.
Yeah. And the corruption of the text. And but I think Bird is perhaps misrepresenting the extent to which Ehrman thinks that the Scripture was corrupted, because he does admit that there are thousands of little mistakes and things, but he does. I found a quote in the book, that very book. It says, "To be sure, of all the hundreds of thousands of textual changes found among our manuscripts, most of them are completely insignificant, immaterial, of no real importance for anything other than showing that scribes could not spell or keep focus any better than the rest of us." So Ehrman himself doesn't say, okay, well, we can't derive anything truthful out of the Scriptures, or
but he says things like, where there are more textual variants than there are words in the New Testament. Yeah. I mean, Ehrman plays both sides.
Yeah.
He makes it sound like you can't trust anything. He's told Bill that there are theological implications that run the length of his arm, but he can't name one.
Yeah.
Bill can't name one.
Oh, I absolutely can.
Yeah, the bloody tear.
The thing I read was actually a quote from Ehrman. We can't.
Well, both of them were, but I think what Ken's pointing out is. Ken, let me ask you this: do you think that Ehrman went back at a later date and clarified what he meant? Because you have these famous sayings of Bart Ehrman. That are the undisputed sayings of Bart Ehrman, where he says, you have, Todd quotes it. There are more textual variants, and there are words in the New Testament.
Misunderstanding of what he's trying to say. He's basically trying to undercut the concept of inerrancy, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, he doesn't dismiss the fact that there are truths in the Bible, in the New Testament, that are being elucidated, historical truths, but. The trick is, well, how do you get it? How do you determine what that is?
Exactly. So I would agree with them that there are some significant ones. I think the long ending of Mark is significant. To me, it's a very fascinating question about the woman caught in adultery. I mean, that's not a minor, is the word of or with or, some preposition or something like that.
Let me ask, how do we know what's historical? We have criterias, multiple attestation. Jesus being baptized in the Jordan River, multiply attested
by independent sources. Yeah.
That helps us place in history. The degree of embarrassment. it's embarrassing to the Christians. Jesus should be that.
Right. And Bird falsely stated that Ehrman used that alone as a criteria.
Right. And
we do get to that question. We do get to that.
And the criteria of dissimilarity. If it sounds like the early church talking, then they probably put those words on Jesus' lips. Yeah. Renee, did you have a question?
Yeah, one more question, and then we're going to take a break.
John Hinkey, question 2. I accept an early high Christology. It seems clear that the early group that eventually became known as Christians did believe that Jesus was a divine figure in some form. It is not clear what form they thought this took, though. The author of John clearly had a very high view of Jesus as comparable to God, but the authors of the Synoptics, circa 70 to 95 AD, were much less clear. What did, quote, Son of God, end quote, mean to the authors of the Synoptic Gospels? If they believed that Jesus was God, why did they never say so outright? Why was there no explicit, quote, Jesus was literally God, end quote, claim? No, holy smokes, guys, that was Yahweh himself.
That's a good question. Thanks for joining in with us, John, on that. Maybe we can come back and address that after the break. We have a little bit of time to put our answers together on that. So remind us again of that question. We'll come back to it after the break. We're going to take about 10 minutes right now and stretch our legs. So stay online, those of you who are. We'll come back in about 10 minutes. Okay, we're coming back online in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Atheist Christian Book Club. Should we call that the Atheist and Christian Book Club? It's confused some people. These are Christian atheists or atheist Christians? Let them wonder. Okay, that's
we're Ebionites.
Hello. Yeah, speak for yourself. I don't want to do that. So
you put that, and
I'm not.
So what we're doing is our book today is How God Became Jesus, which is a response, actually, to next month's book, How Jesus Became God. And yes, we have confused those titles several times, even in our interview, right?
Yes.
So it's very similar. But Bart Ehrman wrote the book How Jesus Became God, which basically makes the case that this whole idea of Jesus' divinity was a late development in Christianity. For the most part, although even if you read carefully in his book, he talks about there are very early accounts that speak kind of more generally to divinity, but that don't get into what exactly the implications of that are. So over time, culminated maybe in the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, you have this idea developed that, well, maybe Jesus was God more than just human. So what we're addressing is this book, and then the response book that was actually released on the same day, How God Became Jesus by Michael Berg, Craig Evans, Charles Hill, a number of other scholars, to answer that. Their case, as we've seen already, is that this is not a late invention, 3rd or 4th century. This is something that goes back to the very fabric, documents, the writings of Paul, the earliest Christian documents that are making the case for that. Now, we had a question come in from John that we kind of left off with right before the break. So could you maybe remind us of that question? And
yeah, I think we were right here with, I think most critics of Bart Ehrman are
No, that's new.
Oh, is that the new one?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Question 2.
Oh, you're there.
Question, you're back. You can go ahead and do it. I didn't see you back there. Thanks.
It says, I accept an early high Christology. It seems clear that the early group that eventually became known as Christians did believe that Jesus was a divine figure in some form. It is not clear what form they thought this took, though. The author of John clearly had a very high view of Jesus as comparable to God, but the authors of the Synoptics were much less clear. What did Son of God mean to the authors of the Synoptic Gospels? If they believed that Jesus was God, why did they never say so outright? Why was there no explicit Jesus was literally God claim? No, holy smokes, guys, that was Yahweh himself.
Now, I would like to find the Bible, the scripture that says, holy smokes, that was Yahweh himself. John, that was colorful, nice way of saying it. I think Jim wanted to add something, maybe?
Okay, so the Pauline epistles came first. There's and the caller here is saying a high Christology, which I would tend to agree with. Okay,
Hey, by the way, just let people set yourself up a little bit here.
I don't need to plug the show.
No, well, I just say
I don't need to plug
atheist.
I don't need to plug atheist eggs on YouTube. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. So this might seem like a dumb question. I should probably already know this, but even though me, and probably most of you here disagree on the authorship of the Gospels, who actually wrote them, Brady and I have talked ad nauseum about it, but whoever did write them did undoubtedly have access to the Pauline epistles? Yes? Had to have, right?
Yeah, almost had.
Is there any disagreement that there's not? Is there anyone? Is there any
Like
school of thought out there?
They're probably in circulation. Probably.
Even the mythicists agreed that Paul existed.
Okay, so then that leads me to these people that are saying Mark, because I've even caught myself saying that Mark, low Christology up to John, so why would we say that the low Christology of Mark if they had the 13 epistles at their fingertips? Why would
because Mark is low Christology. But
why is it low if they have access to Paul and it's
more like U-shaped. It starts off high with Paul, dips down with Mark, and then comes back up with John.
Yeah. Okay, who's saying it's low? It's Bart Ehrman is saying it's low.
Less explicit. I think that was John's point on the caller. I mean
absence of evidence can sometimes be evidence of absence, or the other way around.
But Mark starts out by saying the gospel of the Son of God, Jesus Christ.
I think what John was asking though is what exactly does that mean? And I think in the book it takes. They try to unpack that a little bit.
So it's not just absence of evidence, but there's also in Mark 10 the story of I'll read it here. As he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." So there you have, and I know that people want to read into it and say, "Oh, well, he's saying he's God there." Well, I don't read that. That's a reading into it. I think Jesus was explicitly being humble. Saying, "I'm not God."
And Michael Bird, like
don't pump me up.
When Jesus forgave the man's sins in Mark 7, I believe it is, or whatever, the paralytic, and he said, "Oh, well, it's easier to just say your sins." And they're going, "Whoa, where'd that come from? That sounds like God talking." Well, that could be, as Michael Bird articulated, a rogue priest, someone who is kind of like out in left field that is a rabbi and says, today I just feel like forgiving some sins.
Well, even Jesus gave,
not necessarily a high Christology.
Even other people, that his disciples had the authority, they had the keys to loose things on heaven and loose things on earth. So it wasn't like Jesus was exclusively, as a divine being, the only one.
I think his disciples they'll argue that Jesus authorized them to proclaim it, but they had no intrinsic power of their own to forgive sin or die. To be a substitute for somebody's sins or something.
Well,
like
Jesus
that.
could have been channeling God in the same way.
Yeah, okay.
But if you were to say, the question he had is well received though, on who says it's high or low, because when you're talking high or low, people tend to be thinking metaphysically high or low. But if you talk about it the way German theologians do, von oben or von unten, from above or below, you're talking about it perspectively, how you're approaching the issue. So you start with John, and it's from above. You start with the everlasting Logos, right? But if you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then as Martin Luther said, basically what you have is you're looking at a person's life, and you're led to believe as you look through it that no one ever spoke like this man did. No man ever did the things this man has done. So this must be more than a man. This must be God. It's a kind of perspectival presentation that leads you to a certain kind of conclusion, whereas if you're talking about high-low, people tend to think high meaning God or low meaning man, but perspectively it's very different, I think. So, and I think in Mark too, at the crucifixion, the whole gospel and Mark is about Jesus. I mean, if you want to argue the high or low perspective, you're talking about Jesus throughout the whole thing. But on verse 32 of chapter 15, Mark writes, "Let this Christ, the King of Israel, let this Messiah, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross, so that we may see and believe." And it reminds me of Paul's Christology in Corinthians, the foolishness of God, the weakness of God is stronger than man, and the foolishness of God is wiser than men. And so Jesus' strength is made perfect in doing just about the exact opposite of what everybody else seems to expect. And in that paradox, the truth goes forth. So we sort of want to anachronistically apply what we understand 2,000 years later, but I think in the ancient world, the way Jesus went about the ministry was so, as the Philippian hymn says, he emptied himself and did not think equality with God was something to be grasped. And so in the crucifixion, you see the unexpected completely. You're taken off guard, and it's transformative.
But is doing something unexpected, or is doing something unprecedented, as Kevin kind of put it, is that actually evidence of any kind of truth?
I think he was addressing the questions that came up earlier.
The Christology questions.
Yeah, the Christology questions. Why didn't Jesus come right out and say, or his disciples come right out and say, "Hey, I'm Yahweh. Didn't you know who I am, guys?" Because it's the opposite. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's the leaven. It's the little thing that becomes huge. It's not what everybody expected, the Messiah to come in, wipe out the Roman army, and reestablish the Davidic kingdom.
Well, here's the bottom line. If Jesus said, "I am the bread of life, I am the way, the life, and the truth," if he said those statements, which
which book was that?
John.
John.
Oh, John. Yeah.
Okay.
The high. If he said that thing, don't you think that would be the most important thing you would want to write down if you were Mark or Matthew or Luke? Why would you leave that out?
If you knew it was already
written.
Huh?
If you weren't there to hear it, I don't know. I'm just playing devil's advocate there, but if just like Brady says, why? Because I'm always on him about, hey, there was 3 different last words on the cross, and he said, what if it was 3 people that, maybe they didn't watch the whole thing, and maybe they were over there, they heard something different, and maybe.
Could you imagine Mark saying, "Hey, John, I just got your gospel. Where did this come from? I'm the bread of life. I'm the way. When you've seen me,
who has seen me has seen the Father."
Yeah, I mean, I forgot to tell you, that was when Jesus and we were like on the mountain. You weren't there. You were out fishing, and sorry, my bad. It doesn't make any sense.
I would make a comment on that though. But when you read the rest of the Gospels, and you find a lot of times the disciples themselves admitted themselves as being stupid. They write this into that. For example, when Christ was saying that, Jesus was saying that, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and they're saying how he's talking about the fact we ain't got bread in the boat, and they're talking like they're talking like idiots, and so they get it, or in these Gospels you see. These aren't like the most brilliant men in the world, and so missing "I am the bread of life," I might have been a guy to do that, so it doesn't rule it out in my mind.
And these 4 Gospels would be a lot more suspect if they all covered all the same points.
Yeah, if you were in collusion.
Ask any detective or prosecutor.
Well, look at Mark though for a minute.
Yeah, 95% of Matthew is in Mark, or of Mark is in Matthew. 65% of.
Is that good or bad though? I never could figure out which way you guys are arguing on that.
No, I'm not even trying to make an argument. I'm just.
responding.
It's kind of the opposite of his argument. He's saying if they were all exactly the same, they'd be suspect. Well, 65% and 95% respectively are the same.
But couldn't the prosecutor say the same thing? We have witnesses that are giving different aspects.
I'm not saying it's an argument one way or the other. I'm just saying if you're going to look, is that suspicious or is it not? But it is a thing. It's something.
There clearly was cut and paste, even though they didn't have PCs.
The word, they didn't have PCs, but it's the word usage. I mean, the sentence structure, it is verbatim.
And Michael Bird says, when we come to John, we're talking about midrash, theological interpretation. He really gives a lot of ground up on, as well as Craig Evans did. You notice he didn't go to John because he knows we'd crucify him on John. Go. Was there a question?
No, I was just going to go back to Mark for a moment. Think about what's going on with Mark and why that he writes the way that he writes. And I think that when we start taking within the time frame of what's going on, I mean, he's so close to it. That's why you don't see the names until later. I mean, I think that there's a level of protection in why he doesn't maybe name as many things, or he's not as specific as the later Gospels.
Maybe.
Well, we have another Craig Evans part of the interview. We might not be able to get to all that today, so let's kind of roll part 2. And this is Bill Cluck interviewing Craig Evans on the book How God Became Jesus.
On video too.
Yes. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let's roll that.
But let me go to another point. Bart Ehrman used to believe in an empty tomb. Obviously, now he does not. He believes that, and he said he's read every early Christian source, and he's never seen where any someone convicted of treason was given a proper burial, but that they would leave him on the cross to be eaten by birds. What do you find? Don't you find that?
Yeah, I don't agree with him on that at all, and he knows that. In fact, that's come up at least one of our debates. I think the one that was in front of the Society of Biblical Literature a few years ago. He's really off on that. A lot of people make the assumption, Bart did at the time, that maybe he's a bit more up to date on that, but I appealed to the Roman Digesta, among other things, and he says, oh, well, it's 6th century. Yes, but the Digesta collects 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century laws, and in fact, the one text that I actually appealed to in the Digesta goes back to Emperor Augustus himself, so it's actually pre-crucifixion of Jesus. The Romans, and to say Jesus was convicted of treason is a little bit of a stretch. Sedition, troublemaking, disturbing the peace, that's not necessarily what the Romans called maiestas, and that's where we get treason. Right. That's plotting against the emperor himself. That's raising an army. That's marching. That's a different matter. And so the other thing to keep in mind is Jesus wasn't just some thug who got crucified somewhere in the Roman Empire. It's in Israel. It's on the eve of Passover. It's right outside the walls of Jerusalem. And you have Josephus himself, and I think this is, in my view, this is damning evidence against Bart on this. Josephus himself, in passing, talks about how the Jewish people bury the crucified. Why even the crucified, he says, are buried. And he is mentioning this because of the shameful behavior of the rebels who murdered some of the high priests and simply tossed their bodies out of the city like garbage. And the interesting thing is, and this is not disputed by anybody, Josephus acknowledges it in another place, other sources acknowledge it. Roman authority had capital authority during this period of time. That's not disputed. No. So when Josephus says, why even the crucified, those we crucify, he of course means they're crucified by Roman authority, and they are buried. And so Jody Magnus, one of Bart Ehrman's own colleagues at UNC Chapel Hill, she agrees with me. She does not agree with Bart. The Gospels depict the crucifixion burial sequence properly, fully in step with not just Jewish law and custom, but also in step with practice of that time. Now, I wouldn't apply that to Egypt necessarily. I wouldn't apply it to Greece or to Italy. I'm talking about Israel during the time of the procurators. Israel did have a privileged status at that time within the empire. Post 70, post 135, I don't know. It's probably different. But in the 30s, that's peacetime Israel. Not a chance any of those bodies would be left hanging on the cross on the eve of Passover right there in Jerusalem.
But, it's not only Bart Ehrman. John Dominic Crossan has said that he was probably thrown to the side of the road, which would have been the common practice, and buried in a common grave. No?
This is what got this whole thing cascading. I know Dom, he started this in 1994. Bart quotes that. Bart needs to get up to date on that. Crossan, personally and in private, has retracted the view. He realizes how weak it is archaeologically, and he just didn't know his stuff. I've discussed it with him too. It's just real bad historically informed or not informed exegesis.
And your chapter did make sense about you wouldn't want to leave a body on the tree to desecrate the land. It made sense that you would take it down before sunset. Right. So but you can understand my confusion. You've have compelling arguments and evidence, and Bart seems, he doesn't cite a lot of his evidence. You do, which, to your credit. But I wanted to get our co-founder's question to you before I forgot. You have been involved in the archaeology in Israel. Can you tell us about the remains of a crucified man from the 1st century that were recovered in an ossuary, and how that may speak to the claim that Jesus was probably never buried? I think he's referring to that, where it has the nail through the man's heel and it's calcified, which indicates it was a.
Well, I don't see how that would show that Jesus was never buried.
I guess not, but that maybe that there was someone that had a proper burial, right? That was a convicted criminal. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the problems I think that Dominic Crossan had with his whole argument. He's a wonderful man. He's very sensitive spirit, and he's
got that Irish accent. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, nobody can speak better. And I can just see the tears filling his eyes when he says, "When I think of the fact that there's only one skeleton and one nail out of the thousands who were crucified in the first century." You almost have to hand him a Kleenex at that moment. And so he deduces from that Jesus likely was not buried, but it's a terrible misuse of the data. And he's acknowledged that since. For number one, it's factually not true. We have 140 some nails. Many of them have human calcium on them.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
I discussed this with Rachel Hachlili, the archaeologist who published Jewish burial traditions. By the way, she's totally on my side in this. Unfortunately, and I hate to criticize our precursors and our predecessors. We always learn after the fact that we could have done it a little better. But when bones were recovered from ossuaries and tombs and niches, not all bones are in ossuaries boxes, but some of them are simply in niches inside these tombs. Anyway, when these bones are recovered, the bones have the priority. They're carefully picked up, and the coins, the nails, the pieces, the jewelry, the whatever else in it, just simply drops to the bottom of the ossuary. When everything has been removed, the bones, then the ossuary is tipped over and everything else spills out. And it is a disaster in the way this is done, because the iron objects, the coins, etc., coins that might be attached to the roof of the mouth, for example, and what that signifies, other things, the stratigraphy, you might say, using an archaeology analogy, all of that is violated, all of that data is lost, and the materials are simply dumped. And the records are so poor, in some cases, they don't even know if the nails, they can't remember, were they actually in the ossuary or were they on the ledge next to the ossuary? It's just a bollocks mess. And you'd lose your license as an archaeologist if that's how you did work. So anyway, that is to say, they probably have dozens of nails that had been in crucified victims long enough to absorb when the nails rust, which would happen within a year or so or less. Human calcium becomes impregnated in the rust of the iron, and these are not stainless steel nails like today. And they're harvested, and you might wonder, what? Who cares about these nails? How grisly! But they are valuable for a variety of purposes, including magic, protection. They're like lucky rabbit's feet. I know this is weird. 2 of these nails were found either in or alongside the Caiaphas ossuary, by the way. Simcha Yakubovich said those must have been Jesus's nails that Caiaphas wanted to be buried with as a good luck charm. That's the silliest thing I've heard of. But anyway, my point is the data, unfortunately, are incomplete, inadequately analyzed. It's suggestive. There it is. But we have found another nail in a guy's hand. I've seen it myself.
Wow.
We have the nails with the human calcium recovered from the Caiaphas ossuary, and then another 135 or more nails which have not been properly analyzed, and we never will get full detail, and many of them have human calcium.
I can see very compelling evidence for your side.
Hey, well, I think we got another question from John. John is our most faithful online person, I guess, so far. So we have something.
It's
Renee?
not a question, it's a comment.
Comment, okay.
Yeah. He says, I think most critics of Bart Ehrman are just repeating what they have heard evangelical critics say about him, rather than actually reading Bart Ehrman's work themselves. Ehrman is extremely clear that the vast majority of textual variants are typos and otherwise insignificant. He is also very clear that the variants do not threaten major Christian doctrines, though some of them indisputably have theological implications. And practical implications too. If somebody tries to hand you a poisonous snake and he has a little smiley face. He says, but it is worth noting that evangelical scholars agree that there are an enormous number of variants. Daniel B. Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary has written, the estimates today are closer to 400,000, some even claim 500,000. In short, as Bart Ehrman has so eloquently yet simply put it, there are more variants among the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Although this may leave some feeling uneasy, it is imperative that Christians and non-Christians be honest with the data. And then he followed up with, to be clear, Bart Ehrman accepts a pretty high early Christology.
Okay, and I think this is something, John, that was already pointed out by Ken and others about that. Some of us were saying some of these, real powerful sayings of Bart Ehrman seem to make it sound like, and you have to kind of read further to say, well, he's not saying this really has any doctrinal implications, or serious ones at least. But John makes a good point that we ought not to be talking about Bart Ehrman without being willing to read him. So I know that that's probably true of most Christians, but the Christians here should have already read Jesus Interrupted, and hopefully by next month we'll have read How Jesus Became God. So John has a good point on that. We should be reading Bart Ehrman and not just reading critics of Bart Ehrman, and I hope we do that. I think
one point.
I think Dan had something for us.
I had the wonderful privilege of having dinner with Dan Wallace about a month ago, and he came to UTD to speak on the manuscripts, and he talks about he quoted himself and talks about the number of variants. He said the only reason we have a number of variants is because we have an embarrassing riches of New Testament documents. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't have 400,000 variants if we didn't have 6,000 manuscripts.
And that's just the Greek.
And that's just the Greek. Yeah, that's just the Greek. And in terms of so he says that. He acknowledges he said that. He says it, but then he finishes. He said the only reason we have that many is because of the number of manuscripts that we do have. Mm-hmm. And that's a significant point that Bart might footnote that sometimes.
I would trade in all those copies for just a couple,
Absolutely.
something earlier than people.
Yeah, a lot of the manuscripts are like, the Latin manuscripts are like 800 AD. So
speaking something earlier, I posted this everywhere I could on my Facebook page and on Twitter and on some of you may have read it already on the Atheist Christian Book Club Facebook page. But this remarkable first century Gospel of Gospel of Mark that we were hearing about, that dates earlier than anything that we've had, and it was remember the mummy mask, and we were all looking forward to that. Dan Wallace I think has come out and said it's not a first century document, and so he said I couldn't speak to it because I was under in any way for or against, because I was under a non-disclosure contract. I was led to believe that it had already been evaluated as first century. I was waiting for the publication to come out. It came out. It's late second, possibly early third century document. So I'm with I would love to also trade in a lot. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of the medieval Greek manuscripts. I'd love to trade in for something dated to 70 or 80 AD. That would be nice.
And some of these...
Or 33 would be great.
33, I don't think any of them were written in 33.
Exactly.
Video.
Exactly.
A video. Film it.
Someone who saw the earthquake and the shroud and the zombies and there's eclipse and... come on. Everyone likes to say with the authorship of the Gospels, whenever I bring up, I think it was written the Gospels written a little later, maybe in Greece, by really well-spoken Greeks. Oh, well, they were really illiterate. They really took up the literacy of Judea at the time. Well, if it was highly literate, why not get some pen on paper right then when it happened? I'm not saying that's a smoking gun, but I'm just saying it would have been nice.
We don't have any ancient event that's recorded anything near as... I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm agreeing with you.
Were you saying the same thing?
Well, finish what you were saying.
We don't have any ancient account that's anything as close as the Gospels of any ancient event. You can't find anything nice.
Well, don't forget there were some
special pleading.
Incarnate Greek was the common Greek.
Whatever. Here's the problem: the followers of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants, fishermen, illiterate.
You're channeling Ehrman again, but
that couldn't.
Yeah, I know.
Right, the Greek that we have, these were written decades later by rhetorically trained, highly skilled in Greek.
You would get a
right?
lot of people that say that's not true.
Koine Greek, common Greek.
I get
Yes,
this a
but
lot
the
now.
Greek-
The simplest Greek that you learn, and I think that Ken could speak to this, when you're taking Greek first and second semester, you learn John. That's the simplest Greek in the entire New Testament. It's the highest Christology in the New Testament, but it's simple Koine Greek with a very limited vocabulary.
And let me make one thing clear. There are theological problems in the Gospels, okay, and in the translations. Like, you know, it says, no one knows the time, day, or the hour, neither the Father nor the Son, nor the angels. That nor the Son is heavily disputed. I've read Dan Wallace's book, and you have to go through like chains of manuscript evidence to see, and it's controversial. We don't know whether that nor the Son was omitted, because when the copyists did, when they saw that nor the Son, they went, wait a minute, Jesus doesn't know the day or the hour? That means he's not God. This is a problem. Let's just mark this out. And the same thing like in 1 John, where it says, these three bear witness. The Spirit?
But remember, even
Everybody knows that the blood
changes.
Yes.
They change.
But even Bart
Tear those
Ehrman,
pages out and just go read the rest of the Bible.
but even Bart Ehrman, while he acknowledges the problem, is able to resolve it. So Bart Ehrman's own testimony is, I can tell you what it said for these reasons.
Yes.
Right.
So if Bart Ehrman can tell us what the text said, why can't we say?
Well,
that
and
the
you'll
text
hear
is
Michael
normal?
Burr says you got Bart Ehrman the showman, you got Bart Ehrman the serious guy, and he really tones himself down when he's in the Society of Biblical Literature. You know,
Peer review kind of changes things.
Very true. That was the argument from earlier about Ehrman, and the argument that John online responded to is that when we're reading, and I am reading Ehrman, I have his book right here, I'm not reading just his critics. He says something one time to really imply and make you think, oh no, this is bad. And then at another point has to be like, but not really.
Right.
But then he keeps going back and forth just to like scare you with that thing that he doesn't even agree with. And it just seems very intellectually dishonest.
Bart Ehrman does us a service, though, and I think this is what some people are saying, and I can agree. Christians should have a better knowledge of how we got this. The King James Bible did not flow down on a parachute one day, and so this is the Word of God. And it's something that we shouldn't be ashamed of or run away from, but embrace and say, on the one hand, it would be nice if there weren't thousands of variants. By the way, the variants include a change of spelling. That counts as a variation. And some of them are, I think, do have some significance. Long ending of John. We talked about some others.
These three
the three
and they substituted one.
Mark 16:9-20.
Which was that one?
Well, nobody
that's
takes
the
that
long
seriously.
ending.
Yeah.
You
said John. You meant Mark.
And everybody knows John 8's a complete myth of the woman caught in adultery, that was added in 8.
Are you guys?
Yeah, I think most evangelical scholars would say that probably it may have happened, but it was not in the original. Almost for certain was not in the original. And almost any modern translation is going to either put it in brackets or put it as a footnote.
But there's no divinity there, whether it happened or not.
But see,
I care about that empty tomb, though.
Remember in Luke,
it's good sermon material.
Yeah.
When Jesus is in the garden and he's sweating great drops of blood. As a Christian, I went, people don't sweat blood, and then you get Christian apologists go, well, in extreme cases, you can't sweat blood. I've seen it, and they'll just go pull a rabbit out of their head. It was put in there clearly to combat docetic heresies that were saying Christ seemed to be, they said Christ seemed to be God, or human, I'm sorry, and it wanted to show the humanity of Christ by him sweating.
But the problem with that theory is there's plenty of other evidence in the same book that establishes that Jesus was a human being.
Yeah.
I mean, if it all depended on that, you would have a point. But it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, just like in Thomas, where he says,
show me. The sweats were like blood. I don't think it's
whatever.
Sweating blood.
But like
it's major.
Matters.
Doubting Thomas, where he goes and says, "Let me see the nails and stuff," to show that this wasn't just a docetic. This was a real. Oh, of course it didn't happen. Yeah, all those.
All right. By the way, even in John's Gospel, he says, "Unless I put my hand into the piercing and put my fingers in the nail prints," he doesn't actually do it. there's no recording in John that he actually puts his hand there. When he sees Jesus, it's like...
I forget, does he have a change of heart, though? He starts to believe,
Oh, yeah,
right?
he believes, but he doesn't
He falls down and worships him.
Skeptic turned believer
It's gone to this very day.
He falls down and worships him as God.
Yeah, what
Which is the
verse is
greatest
that?
aside to the reader.
And just like the fish fry at the Sea of Tiberias, Jesus had his disciples after the resurrection. I mean, he's just showing that, making up that story to show, hey, good, I eat fish, I got a real body. You know, because
How do you know that?
because in the early church they had these docetic heresies where they didn't believe Jesus was human, and so the Christian apologists were trying to combat this heresy.
Or they were actually telling real stories that would disprove it. That's why they selected.
Let me say this.
Exactly.
I don't agree with Bill, but in his defense, I will go so far as to say I think that the gospel writers would pick, because they have this great corpus of information to work with, they would pick things for a theological purpose.
Yeah.
So of all the things they knew about Jesus, they said they chose carefully what they wanted to report. John even acknowledges many other things did Jesus do, but these signs I showed you for this reason. And so that means there was a theological agenda. You know, I would acknowledge that.
Do you think that they expected their Gospels to become Scripture?
Who knows? I don't know. That's a good question.
But anyway, Bart Ehrman's scholarly book is called Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, where the Orthodox Church corrupted the Scripture to combat these heresies at the time, like Gnostic heresies. And
but that really depends upon whether or not the texts really were, changed from the time they were written to.
Well, absolutely, they were changed. I mean, they changed in 1984. In addition to the
No, I'm talking like your one story of the reason why Doubting Thomas is in there was to combat this. If it was original, though, why would that not still be a plausible idea that the original is out there? We don't have it, but this really is a historical account of what happened with Thomas.
Well, I think that question revolves around, was it a textual corruption at a later date, or did John write it so late in the, was it written in like 2nd century or something?
That's
and
still
he puts it in there, for that reason.
It can't be ruled out.
What, Ken?
One thing that I never really noticed as a believer, but after I left the faith, that stuck out to me as very implausible in the Gospel of John account of what we're talking about Doubting Thomas, is when Jesus followed up and says, "You have seen and believed, blessed are you who have not seen and believed." If that's not an aside to the reader, I don't know what is.
But then right after
he
that,
actually historically said that to their face, that's implausible.
Well, for me, I'm glad that Thomas was there. I'm a skeptic by nature.
So you don't,
I'm glad he was there.
You're seeing my phone. Blessed are those, who haven't seen my phone and believe it exists. You don't say that.
He's not talking to the room.
He's not talking to the room. He's
future
talking
reader.
to it's the author writing this for us.
You're presuming that motive.
The very next verse right after that one.
You're presuming it as a motive.
Oh, you say
it's still
Ken,
possible.
he
It
has
could
the
be a
next
real
verse.
historical account.
Go ahead.
The very next verse is, "And many other signs truly did Jesus do in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book."
Yeah.
Is that just a catch-all or something? So.
Yeah, it's just like Josephus when he said, "And Jesus did all these 10,000 miracles." What were the miracles?
A list would have been nice.
Yeah.
Well,
Let's do this. So
We don't
we're
need to
kind of
consider.
running out of time. I'm going
interpolation.
to skip this. The third one is a real good one, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go to the last interview, and I think he has some words to say to us. Hopefully, nice. And you ready for the fourth one? You with me?
Hello, I'm Bill Cluck, co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club with James. Now, to the adoption, it seems like the crux of the book is, do we have the early Christians believing in an adoptionist Christology or an incarnational Christology? And I think they refer to like Romans 1:3 and Acts and so forth, where there's all sorts of evidence of exaltation Christology. And, you see it in his baptism, and which is kind of multiply attested. You see this feeling that in the other, I think in Acts, where he's exalted at his resurrection, right? I mean, or adopted. I mean, can you clarify that for us?
Well, I will concede that is far more open, that issue, and I'm speaking again just as somebody that talks about Jesus in the Gospels And I don't mean to sideline Paul and what he has to say about that. Also, remember, he would naturally be swimming against his prior Jewish, quote, Orthodox tradition, and so he would not lightly apply divinity, those concepts, to somebody who obviously was a human. Nobody's denying the humanity of Jesus. That happens later in the 2nd century when the Gnostics come on the scene. Nobody is denying the reality of Jesus' humanity in the 1st century. And so for him lightly to just say, well, why don't we talk about him as pre-existent? Why don't we talk about him as divine? Why don't we, I just don't see Paul doing this lightly. And so you take his, what are called Christ hymns usually, Philippians 2, Colossians 1.
Where he says fullness of God and not wanting to grasp. So you think that reflects a high Christology?
A Yahweh text comes into play in Philippians 2. This is pretty heavy stuff coming from and when he writes Philippians, I know there are 2 different imprisonments that are in view. I tend to go with the later one. I put Philippians in the early 60s, 63 perhaps, something like that. That still could be prior to the composition of Mark by a few years. And that is a pretty heavy-duty Christology. However, you are right to say in Romans 1, he's declared with power, however that should be understood, Romans 1, 3, and 4, Son of God by the resurrection. What is that, a confirmation that he's Son of God after all along? Is that what he means? Or does he become Son of God right then? Or what about the baptism? You are my son. Does that mean you are now my son? So I see that exegetically and historically and critically as fair game that's open for discussion. However, with Christian theology, you begin pulling in Paul, Philippians 2, you pull in John 1, and then the theologians say, okay, that's what settles it. And so you end up with what the early church did end up with, which is the classic expression of Christology.
And Barterman believes that early Christianity did believe that he was God. Doesn't he say that? Yeah. So that's
the difference between me and Bart on this point, as I said earlier, is I think this the idea of divinity is in the ministry itself. Even if there's not a full kind of Chalcedonian, Nicene understanding of that, that the roots of that are pre-Easter. And it's not like, I reject the idea that after preaching Jesus as Israel's Messiah, and he's resurrected, after 20, 30 years of that, exposed to Greeks and Romans who have a whole different kind of an idea of who a Savior ought to be, Christians said, oh, you know what, I think it's time we talk about Jesus as God, and maybe we'll start getting some more traction in evangelism. I don't see that. I reject that idea.
One last, Michael Bird said that, Barterman makes a mistake. There's 3 adoptionist sayings, like in the baptism, the transfiguration, and the trial. But if the trial's fictional, and obviously the transfiguration, he's just trying to show, the gospel writer's trying to show that, here's Elijah who represents the prophets, here's Moses who represents the law, which the Old Testament was referred to the law and the prophets. So he's just actually creating a story to show that Jesus is the culmination of the law and the prophets. Does that make sense? So there would only be one, adoptionist theme.
Well, yeah, perhaps, but I don't reject the trial scene at all. And
but how would they know, since the disciples weren't there?
What's that?
The disciples weren't there, so how would they know what was said at the trial?
Okay, that's good. Thanks for saying that. I was going to say that, and then that goes back once again to John Dominic Crossan. That's widely viewed in critical scholarship, and I'm thinking of some of the greats out there as rather simplistic, if not naive. It's like, I see. So a decision with regard to a controversial figure that everybody's been talking about the past week in Jerusalem, a decision that results in his execution very publicly. We have no idea on what basis that decision was made. Nobody's talking. The servants, Sanhedrin members who are present, other staff and retainers. Not a lips are sealed. Not a person said a thing, and there are the disciples, and they're not curious anyway. As Dom puts it, as in his Irish way of talking, those who care weren't there.
You're right.
Those who were there
Didn't
care. Well, Shazam! If that isn't sophisticated, wouldn't it be nice in Washington, D.C., for example, if secrets could be kept that well?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, that's not good human psychology, and it's not critical history.
When John Ottoman Crossan says it looks like it came down from Mount Sinai, with that voice of his, Oh, by the way,
Transfiguration.
Man, you've been great, Dr. Evans, and you've really clarified a lot of things. Is there anything you'd like to say to our book club members about the book or anything? Yeah,
I just in relating to the general topic, but more broadly, I make a plea that we be fair with the evidence. I'm not making a plea that we be credulous and we accept anything just because it's an old source. But and I'm not speaking to you as much as I am speaking to my own discipline. We are harmful on ourselves. I'm talking about hyper-skepticism. Skepticism is not the same thing as criticism. And to believe something on flimsy grounds is not critical. To disbelieve something, to reject something on very flimsy grounds, that's not critical either. And I think some of this starts with PhD students. They feel insecure, and it's kind of the game they play. I'm more skeptical than you are. And what they mean by that is I'm more critical than you are. No, you're not. You don't know the sources very well. You don't understand historiography very well. You don't know what to do with evidence very well. You haven't thought through the criteria very well. And so what you do is you press an escape button and you just say, I don't accept anything, as if somehow that makes you smart, somehow that makes you critical. What it means is you're not very well informed. You don't know the sources very well. And it is difficult. We're talking about half a dozen languages, for crying out loud. 3, 4, 5 different disciplines. Mm-hmm. It is challenging. It isn't easy. You don't learn it in 3, 4 years of PhD studies. It's decades of hard work. So my plea then is, look, we have precious little evidence from antiquity. Treat it as precious. I'm not saying be uncritical with it or bow down before it and venerate it. I'm just saying listen to it, let it say what it has to say, but don't just throw it under the bus because it's something you don't want to hear or it's something you disagree with. And that's Greco-Roman, it's Jewish, it's Christian, it's whatever from antiquity. If we've got old sources, listen to them. If they're clearly contradicted by better sources, other sources, archaeology, fine. But don't be so quick to dispense with the evidence from antiquity. And related to that is the ancients weren't as stupid as we think. The ancients weren't as gullible and naive as we think. We got to give them a little more credit. Anyway, that's all.
Well, there's someone I met at one of our atheist meetings, and she goes, "Oh, I believe Jesus never existed." And I go, "Well, what would give you that idea?" And she goes, "Oh, Richard Carrier said that." And I go, "Well, what?" And she goes, "And he's peer reviewed." And I'm going, so that became the standing joke. But you guys, Christians have their work cut out for you. Because they just will listen to someone on the internet, one of these, experts like, Robert Price or Carrier or whatever, or David Fitzgerald, who just has a history degree, and they take it as gospel because they don't want to go into the nuances and the complexities like you have today. Oh, by the way, so you're just down in Houston. I'd love. We had Tim McGrew here recently and had a lot of fun with him at the meeting. If you ever come up to Dallas, please give us a holler, okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you're right.
So, yeah, we've really enjoyed talking.
Thank you for saying that.
You bet. We'd love to have you, and thanks. You really clarified a lot of stuff, and thanks for your expertise.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, we're back from that, and how many enjoyed that? He kind of spoke his mind on that one, didn't he, on that part of the interview?
Oh, yeah. Really did.
Okay, well, anyway.
Bill did a phenomenal job on the interview.
Yeah, he did.
I think he should replace Bill Maher.
Well, again, I want to thank everyone for being at the Atheist Christian Book Club, and if you want to hang around a little bit to continue the conversation, but we are trying to stay on time pretty much. So our book for June 1st for today has been How God Became Jesus by Michael Bird, Craig Evans, and others. Next month, and as John mentioned, our Facebook caller, we want to make sure we actually read Bart Ehrman, so let's try to have that read this time. If you don't have it finished, it may count against you on your final grade. So how Jesus became God, and we will definitely see the other side of this story and be able to interact with that. That's going to be on July 6th. We already have an interview that Bill did with Michael Bird. Great audio and video all the way from Melbourne, Australia, believe it or not. So he has some great insights for us as that. We did skip one of the interviews that I'm going to post on our Atheist Christian Book Club Facebook page. I'll post all four of them probably. You go back and see those if you want to.
And Michael Bird, if you go on YouTube, debated Bart Ehrman a couple years ago. And Michael Bird has this great sense of humor. He's from Australia, and it was a real... Bart Ehrman said, boy, you really ratcheted up the debate. I mean, it's really... Because you hear Bart Ehrman go, whoa, that is amazing. And then you hear Michael, and he's like, man, he really... came back really strong.
Seriously, if you don't have time to read the book, and I'll send you the link if you'll watch that. It's about 2-hour debate. If you watch that debate for 2 hours, you will kind of get a good idea without having to finish the book or read the book. The reading the book is always the best way to go. And I think we have one more comment or question from our...
John just said excellent interview, and thank you, Mr. Cluck, for giving mythicism the appropriate scorn.
Just looking at the evidence.
Well, again, thank you for being part of the Atheist Christian Book Club. We have more online as well at www.atheistchristianbookclub.com. Look forward to seeing you guys on July 6th and with Bart Ehrman, How Jesus Became God. Thanks so much.